Yes.
In your latest book, you compare affirmative action with a medicine. Does it mean that the USA are ill? Is racism the illness, and is it an illness that can be cured?
Yes, I think it is an illness that can be cured. You're right. I at one point in that book, For Discrimination, I say that affirmative action is like any other medicine. It can be toxic if you take too much of it, but like a good medicine, it can be helpful. And on your question of do I think that racism in America can be cured? The answer is yes, I think. Now, in the history of the United States, in talk about racism, there's been a lot of talk about racism. People have written many, many books about racism in America, many, many speeches. You can divide talk about racism in America. You can divide the talk into two big camps. One camp is, I call it the optimistic camp, and one camp is the pessimistic camp. Let me say a few words about the pessimistic camp first, because actually it's the more interesting of the two. The pessimistic camp is the camp that believes that racism in America is incurable, that there will always be racism in America, that there will never be racial equality in America. So someone else earlier mentioned Martin Luther King Jr., the Civil Rights Movement. You're familiar with the song "We Shall Overcome." "We Shall Overcome" was an important song that was sung in demonstrations in the 1950s, well, 1960s. There's some people in America who believe that we shall not overcome, that America is just so thoroughly racist that no matter what, racism will always be an important force in American life. And there are many important and impressive people who believe that. So for instance, have you all heard of Thomas Jefferson? Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the third president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson believed that racism in the United States was incurable. He thought that blacks and whites would never be able to live together on an equal basis in the United States. Another person who had a very similar belief was Abraham Lincoln. Have you all heard of Abraham Lincoln? Abraham Lincoln was the president of the United States during the Civil War. He was the 16th president of the United States. He too believed that racism was so deep that it was incurable. And in fact, throughout Lincoln's life, he was constantly looking for ways to, he thought that the only way that blacks and whites could figure out a decent future was for black people to leave the United States and maybe go to Africa or Central America. Other people who have had this belief, have you ever heard the name Malcolm X?
Yes.
Okay. Malcolm X was a pessimist. He did not think that blacks and whites would be able to get along in the United States. So there's a long tradition of pessimism with respect to race. That's one tradition. That's not the tradition that I put myself in. I voice another tradition. There's an optimistic tradition. There's a tradition that believes that though racism is deeply embedded in American life, there's a tradition that believes we shall overcome. And in the history of America, there are two people in particular that I think have been especially eloquent in voicing this optimistic tradition. In the 19th century, the great voice of the optimistic tradition was a man by the name of Frederick Douglass. Does that name mean anything to anyone? Frederick Douglass was a slave. He ran away from slavery, and he became an abolitionist. And he believed that racism would be overcome in the United States. And then in the 20th century, the great voice of optimism was Martin Luther King Jr. And in fact, his I Have a Dream speech, August 1963, would be the single best example of his belief. And I would put myself in that tradition. I think, over the past 50 years, remember, I was born in 1954. So in my lifetime, I've come from a point in which, in South Carolina, when I was born, blacks and whites lived in completely different universes. And blacks were repressed. When I was born in 1954, it would have been virtually inconceivable, the idea of a black president of the United States. But, this is 2013, and Barack Obama is a black American and is president of the United States. So the United States has changed a good bit. And I think that with intelligent, persistent, collective action, it can change even more.